Imagine this. You're a long-haul trucker on I-25 in Colorado. It's 2 in the morning. The snow's coming down so hard, it looks like static on an old TV, and you've got maybe a quarter tank left. Then, through the whiteout, a diner. Neon lights glowing through the storm, chrome shining like it's 1948. Inside, a woman named Margot smiles like she's been waiting for you all night. You eat, you pay, and every coin in your change reads the same year, 1948. Next morning you come back, and the diner's gone, just open field. Welcome to the Long Road Stories. I'm Hank, and tonight we're diving into the legend of the Snowbound Diner, a place that only appears when the storm is bad enough to kill you. If you love true road legends, tap subscribe and tell me your state below. Now, let's roll into the dark. The story you're about to hear involves one of the strangest and most enduring legends of Colorado's mountain highways. Associated with Colorado's mountain passes and major highways, the legend of the Snowbound Diner, a restaurant that appears during severe winter storms, serves food and coffee that tastes perfectly normal and perfectly delicious, and pays its customers in currency that hasn't been in circulation for over 75 years. This phenomenon has been reported by hundreds of truckers and travelers over the decades, each account more or less identical in its basic elements, each witness independent and unaware of the other's experiences, each person left with physical evidence that something profoundly strange has occurred. The diner itself exists in a kind of temporal paradox. It's definitively real while you're inside it. You can touch the furniture and eat the food and hold the coins in your hand. But it doesn't exist in any official registry. It doesn't appear on any highway maps, and no amount of searching will locate it during daylight hours or clear weather conditions. It appears only during the worst weather, only during the moments when people are desperate, only when they need it most. And it seems to operate according to rules that have nothing to do with conventional economics or the normal passage of time. This is the story of David Thornton, a trucker with 43 years of driving experience, who encountered the Snowbound Diner on a specific night in February, and whose experience of that night would lead him to question everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality itself. David Thornton had been driving commercially for 43 years, hauling freight across America in every possible weather condition, during every possible season, along every conceivable route that the continental United States had to offer. He'd driven through hurricanes in the south, through thunderstorms in the Midwest, through blinding sandstorms in the Southwest. But he'd learned one thing from all those years on the road: respect the weather. Weather is patient, weather is powerful. Weather doesn't care about your schedule, or your deadlines, or your cargo, or how urgently you need to reach your destination. And on this particular day in February, the weather was making its intentions very clear. The forecast had been predicting a major winter storm system moving into Colorado from the northwest, potentially bringing 2 feet or more of snow. Gusting winds reaching up to 50 miles per hour, and visibility that could drop to near zero conditions. The National Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning that began at 6 p.m. and was scheduled to continue through sunrise the following morning. Smart drivers were already pulling off the highways, finding shelter, securing their vehicles, and settling in to wait out the storm. But David had a delivery deadline, cargo that needed to reach Denver by morning, and he'd made the calculation that if he pushed hard and maintained his speed, he could cross the worst of the storm's path before the snow became truly serious. That calculation, made at 4:30 in the afternoon while the sky was still relatively clear and the snow hadn't yet begun falling, would turn out to be the most consequential decision of his entire life. David had made it past Pueblo, heading north on Interstate 25 toward Denver, when the first flakes began appearing on his windshield. They were few and far between at first, individual snowflakes that his wipers could easily handle, but David could see the wall of weather approaching from the north like a visible advancing army, a solid mass of white that was clearly going to engulf the highway within the next 30 minutes. He should have pulled off. He should have taken the next exit and found a truck stop or a motel or literally any place to shelter for the night. But David was only about 70 miles from Denver at that point, and his sense of invincibility, built from decades of successful highway driving without serious incident, made him think he could stay ahead of the weather if he just pushed a little harder. By 5:45 p.m., the sky had darkened dramatically. The snow was falling so thickly that it was difficult to see even the road directly in front of his truck, and the wind was beginning to push his 18-wheeler around on the highway, requiring constant correction to keep the vehicle in his lane. Other vehicles were pulling off the road, using their emergency flashes to indicate they were stopping, and David passed several trucks that had already abandoned the attempt to continue, their drivers unwilling to take the risk of driving blind through conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. David told himself that he was going to drive 10 more miles, assess the conditions, and then make a decision about whether to continue. But 10 miles later, the situation hadn't improved, and 10 miles after that, it was even worse, and before he knew what was happening, David was driving blind through a complete whiteout, unable to see anything beyond a few feet of visibility, unable to see the road markings, unable to see other vehicles if they were there, driving almost entirely on faith and instinct. By 6:30 p.m., David was in genuine distress. His fuel gauge was reading slightly above half a tank when he'd started this section of highway, which should have been plenty to reach Denver. But the harsh driving conditions, the wind resistance, the need to go slowly to maintain any kind of control, the constant acceleration and deceleration to avoid obstacles he could barely see, were consuming fuel at a rate considerably higher than normal. David did the math in his head and realized that at his current consumption rate, he might not have enough fuel to reach Denver. The anxiety of that realization began to climb. He was alone on the highway in a complete blizzard, visibility essentially zero, fuel running lower than he liked, and no clear, safe option for what to do about it. He couldn't safely pull off the road because he couldn't see where the road actually ended. Pulling off in the wrong place could result in his truck going into a ditch or colliding with something he couldn't see. He couldn't see any exit signs that might lead to shelter. He was trapped in a gray-white void with nothing but the sound of wind and the sensation of his vehicle moving forward, and the fuel gauge kept dropping. David started actively praying, something he rarely did, asking for intervention from whatever higher power might be listening, asking to be given some kind of sign or help or indication of what he should do. And then, at 7:12 p.m., his prayers seemed to be answered in the most unexpected way. The impossible appearance. David was beginning to truly panic, his fuel gauge now reading below a quarter tank, which at his current consumption rate meant he had maybe 40 minutes of driving left before his truck would simply run out of gas and stall, leaving him trapped in a vehicle without heat in the middle of the worst blizzard he'd ever experienced. He was starting to consider the options for survival if that happened. How long the truck's heat would last once the engine died. Whether he should abandon the truck and try to walk to find help, whether anyone would ever find him, or if he'd simply become another highway tragedy. And then, as if it had materialized out of the snow itself, because honestly, that's what it seemed like, a structure appeared on the right side of the highway, a diner. An actual physical diner, complete with vintage neon lighting, chrome details catching and reflecting what little light existed in the blizzard, and a parking lot with a handful of parking spaces. David's first instinct was confusion. He'd been driving this stretch of Interstate 25 for the past 20 minutes without seeing anything, and now suddenly there was a restaurant. He should have passed it on previous trips on this same route. He should have seen it before. But there it was, undeniably present, and more importantly, the lights were on, which meant it was open, which meant there would be heat inside, and possibly, if he was incredibly lucky, someone who could help him figure out his fuel situation. The desperate decision. David didn't allow himself to overthink it. He spotted the turn that led into the diner's parking lot, signaled despite there being no other vehicles visible to signal to, and carefully navigated the turn. The snow was so deep in the parking lot that it was difficult to judge where the actual parking spaces were, but David pulled his truck into what appeared to be the side parking area, where he assumed large vehicles like his truck were meant to park. He shut off the engine, not wanting to waste any of his remaining fuel, and sat in his cab for a moment, listening to the wind howling around his truck, watching the snow accumulate on his windshield. The diner glowed with a warm, inviting light that seemed almost impossibly welcoming given the hellish conditions outside. David grabbed his keys, locked his truck, and fought through the snow toward the diner's front entrance, the cold hitting him like a physical blow as soon as he stepped out of the vehicle, the wind trying to push him sideways, the snow immediately beginning to stick to his face and eyes and coat. He reached the diner's front door, pulled it open, and stepped into a world that felt profoundly out of time. The moment David stepped through the diner door, the wind and snow and cold seemed to belong to another world entirely. The diner was warm, aggressively warm, the kind of warmth that comes from heat being pumped through a space actively and consistently. The smells that hit David were overwhelming in their ordinariness. Coffee, bacon, eggs, fresh pie, the exact smells you'd expect to encounter in a traditional American diner at 8 in the evening. The interior was decorated in what David could only describe as authentic 1940s style, not a reproduction or a themed restaurant trying to evoke that era, but what appeared to be the genuine article. Vinyl booths with worn red upholstery lined both walls. Chrome trim edged the booth fronts and the counter. The floor was black and white tile, exactly like diners from that specific era. The counter had a dozen stools with red vinyl seats, each one perfect for perching while you ate your meal and watched the short order cook working behind the counter. Framed photographs covered the walls, photographs in black and white, most of them showing groups of people in clothing that looked like it came straight from the 1940s, people posing in front of this exact diner in what looked like summer weather, when the diner's parking lot was filled with cars that were decades old, vehicles from the 40s and 50s, chrome-heavy and rounded and impossibly huge by modern standards. David stood in the diner's entrance for perhaps 10 seconds, dripping snow onto the threshold, just trying to process what he was seeing. The diner was completely empty, except for one person, a waitress standing behind the counter, a woman who appeared to be in her 60s or 70s, wearing a uniform that was unmistakably from the 1940s, a white dress with a small apron, her hair styled in the victory rolls that had been popular in that era, her makeup applied with the careful precision of someone from that time period. The waitress looked up at David with a smile that seemed completely unsurprised by his sudden appearance, as if she'd been expecting him all along, as if muddy truckers dripping snow on her threshold was an entirely routine occurrence. "Welcome to Margot's Diner," she said, her voice warm and welcoming, carrying an accent that David couldn't quite place. Not quite Southern, not quite Midwestern, something in between, something that sounded like it belonged to another era. "Come on in, honey." "You'd look half frozen. Sit anywhere you like." David moved further into the diner, still processing the surreality of the situation. He chose a booth near the window so he could see his truck, needing the visual confirmation that his vehicle was still there, that he hadn't entered some kind of hallucination or dream state. The waitress, Margot apparently, moved around the counter and approached his booth, pulling a small notebook from her apron pocket and producing a pen with the ease of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times. She poured a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it, placing the cup and saucer in front of him with a practiced motion that was simultaneously efficient and profoundly kind. "You look like you could use something warm inside you," Margot said, and he found himself nodding mutely because his mind was still struggling to make sense of where he was and how he'd gotten here. Margot waited for him to say something, and when he didn't, she continued, "Specials today are meatloaf, pot roast, and chicken fried steak. All of them come with your choice of vegetables and a dinner roll. Or if you want something simpler, I can get you a burger or a ham sandwich." "What sounds good to you?" David ordered the meatloaf almost without thinking. It was the first option she'd mentioned, and his mind wasn't processing anything clearly enough to make deliberate choices. Margot wrote down his order, then paused and looked at him more carefully, her head tilting slightly in a gesture that suggested concern. "You okay, hun?" she asked. "You look like you've been through something." David tried to explain about the blizzard, about running low on fuel, about how desperately he'd needed to find shelter. Margot listened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy, nodding along with his story. When he finished, she said, "You picked a good night to find us. Roads closed about 3 miles north of here. State Highway Patrol shut it down maybe 20 minutes ago. You couldn't have made it through anyway." David felt a mix of relief that he hadn't been foolish enough to push through completely closed roads, and confusion about how a road could close without him hearing it on the radio. He'd been listening to the Weather Service radio all evening, and he hadn't heard anything about road closures. He was about to ask Margot about it when she moved away to place his order with the cook, and he found his attention drawn to the wall behind the counter. There was a clock there. An old-fashioned clock with Roman numerals and hands that appeared to be moving at a normal rate. The clock read 8:37 p.m. David checked his phone to confirm the time, and his phone agreed, 8:37 p.m. But something about the clock felt wrong, and when David looked more closely, he realized that the clock wasn't moving. The hands were frozen at 8:37, and they didn't appear to have moved at all since he'd looked at them initially. He watched the clock for perhaps 30 seconds, expecting the second hand to move, expecting the minute hand to advance, but nothing happened. The clock remained exactly as it was. Margot returned to David's table a few minutes later with his food, and he had to admit that whatever he'd been expecting, the meatloaf that she placed in front of him absolutely met that expectation and exceeded it. It was hot, clearly freshly cooked, the top surface showing evidence that it had just come out of the oven. The vegetables, mashed potatoes and green beans, were steaming. The dinner roll was soft and warm, with a slight sheen that suggested butter had been brushed across its surface. David, who hadn't realized how hungry he was, began eating immediately, and the food was genuinely delicious in a way that reminded him of eating in diners when he was young, before food started tasting like it had been processed and packaged and shipped across the country. Every bite was rich and flavorful, nothing tasting artificial or preserved or frozen, everything tasting like it had been prepared specifically for him, specifically for this moment. As David ate, he began to notice more strange details about the diner. The other booths remained completely empty throughout the entire time he was there. No one else came in, no other customers appeared. The diner remained just him and Margot, and presumably a cook somewhere in the back that he never saw. The radio that was playing soft instrumental music in the background, clearly something from the 1940s, music that sounded like it was coming from the era of big bands and Frank Sinatra, never changed songs. The same music played on a loop throughout his meal, or at least it appeared to be the same music, the same melodies, the same recording. The window that looked out into the parking lot showed his truck exactly where he'd parked it, but David noticed that the snow seemed to not be accumulating on his truck. Snow continued to fall heavily outside. The blizzard was clearly still raging, but his truck remained relatively clear, as if the snow was somehow avoiding his vehicle specifically. Halfway through his meal, David began to genuinely notice that something was wrong, or at least profoundly different from what he would have expected. He'd been in hundreds of diners over his 43 years of driving, and he could recognize the 1,000 small signs that indicated normalcy, the ambient sound of other people, the clink of dishes being washed, the sound of voices, the shuffle of activity. This diner was almost completely silent, except for the radio music and the occasional sound of something in the kitchen. When David finished his meal and Margot came to clear his plate, he found himself asking questions. "How long have you been running this diner? I've driven this route dozens of times, and I don't remember ever seeing this place before." Margot smiled, and for just a fraction of a second, her expression looked sad. Not just sad, but profoundly weary. The expression of someone who'd been asked the same questions thousands of times and never had a good answer. "Oh, we've been here for quite a while," she said, which was not actually an answer to his question. "Been serving travelers for a long time. You want some pie? I've got apple, pecan, and cherry today." David ordered a slice of apple pie with coffee, more because he was trying to process what was happening than because he was hungry. While he waited for the pie, David pulled out his phone and tried to search for information about a diner on this section of Interstate 25. His search came up completely empty. No results for a diner called Margot's, no results for vintage diners on this highway section, nothing that matched the place he was currently sitting in. When Margot brought David's pie, she placed the plate in front of him and then said, "Let me get your check for you," disappearing behind the counter before David could respond. She returned after a few minutes with a small paper ticket, handwritten in ink. The paper itself yellowed with age and coffee stains. The bill read simply, "Meatloaf, $1.85, pie, $0.75, coffee, $0.20, total, $2.80. David stared at the bill for perhaps 20 seconds, unable to process what he was reading. The prices were not just reasonable, they were impossible. You couldn't buy a meal for under $3 in 2025. You couldn't get coffee for 20 cents anywhere in America. The prices on this bill suggested a time period of at least 50 years ago, possibly longer. David reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill, intending to give it to Margot as payment, but something stopped him. He looked at Margot and said, "These prices, are these the current prices?" Margot tilted her head, the same gesture she'd used before when showing concern. "Of course they're the current prices," she said. "That's what we charge. If you need to pay with something larger, I can make change." David handed her the $20 bill, and Margot took it and moved to the register at the counter. He heard the cash register ding as she opened it, heard her counting out change, and then she returned to his booth and placed the change on the table beside his plate. The change consisted of several dollar bills, new bills that showed recently circulated currency, and a collection of coins. David looked at those coins, and his entire understanding of what was happening shifted fundamentally. Every single coin was stamped with the year 1948. He checked them carefully. Quarters from 1948, dimes from 1948, nickels from 1948, even a couple of pennies from 1948. The coins were slightly worn, indicating they'd been circulated and used, but they were genuine coins from the actual year 1948. David looked up at Margot, his voice uncertain. "These are from 1948. Margot didn't seem particularly surprised by his observation. "Well, yes," she said. "That's what we have. Is there a problem?" The question seemed almost absurd in its casualness. Is there a problem? David was holding coins that were nearly 80 years old, far too old to still be in circulation in normal circumstances, and she was asking if there was a problem, as if this was a perfectly ordinary transaction. David left a quarter as a tip, though even as he did it, he felt almost criminal for tipping with a coin worth far more than its monetary value as a piece of currency, and spent the next hour sitting in the diner booth, nursing coffee and trying to make sense of what was happening. He pulled out his phone multiple times, trying to get information about Margot's diner, trying to find any internet reference to this place, trying to determine his exact location so he could understand where he actually was. But his phone wouldn't cooperate. Maps couldn't determine his location. Searches came up empty. His cellular signal, which had been consistently strong until he entered the diner, seemed to have disappeared. He had 0 bars of signal, which was strange given that he was sitting beside a window looking out at a highway that should have been close enough to communication towers. David tried asking Margot questions, but she seemed reluctant to provide detailed answers. When he asked how long she'd worked at the diner, she said, "A long time." When he asked who owned the place, she said, "We do, hun," without clarifying who exactly "we" included. When he asked if there were any other employees, she simply said, "It's just me most nights." Most nights? The implication that she was regularly working the night shift alone, serving customers in a diner that had no apparent other vehicles besides his truck, struck David as profoundly strange. When he asked if the diner had a phone he could use to call a friend, Margot said, "No phone, hun. Just us and the road and the snow." David began to notice that his perception of time inside the diner felt strange. He'd been sitting in the booth for what felt like maybe an hour, certainly not longer than 90 minutes. But when he checked his phone, it showed that almost 4 hours had passed since he'd entered the diner. The time on his phone showed 11:47 p.m. He found this to be genuinely distressing. 4 hours? He'd been in the diner for only a subjective 70 minutes or so, maybe an hour and a half at most, and yet his phone insisted that 4 hours had elapsed. He looked at Margot, who was wiping down the counter with a cloth, moving with the lazy, practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this exact action 10,000 times. "How long have I been here?" he asked. Margot paused her wiping and seemed to think about the question. "Time's funny in here," she said finally. "It passes different than it does outside. That happens sometimes, when the weather's bad, when things are different." Again, he found himself frustrated by her non-answer. What did "time passes different" even mean? Was she implying that time literally moved at a different rate inside the diner than it did outside? Was she suggesting that an hour inside somehow equaled multiple hours outside? David looked out the window at his truck, at the snow still falling heavily, and he found himself afraid. Something was deeply wrong here, something that violated his understanding of how the world worked. He needed to leave. He needed to get back to his truck, back to the highway, back to somewhere that made sense according to the laws of physics and logic and reality as he understood them. David stood up from his booth and told Margot that he needed to get back on the road, that he'd imposing on her time enough. Margot nodded without expression and moved back to the register. "Come back and see us sometime," she said, which he found to be an odd thing to say, as if he could simply return any time he wanted, as if the diner would definitely still be here next time he drove this route. David reached for his jacket and noticed for the first time that it appeared completely dry. Not just mostly dry, but completely dry, despite the fact that he'd come through a heavy blizzard to get to the diner. His hair wasn't wet, his pants weren't wet. It was as if the snow had never actually made contact with him. "Thank you for the meal," David told Margot, and she smiled in that same weary way she'd smiled before. "Drive safe," she said. "The road's clear now. You should make good time." David stepped out of the diner and was immediately shocked to discover that the blizzard had completely stopped. The snow that had been falling so heavily just moments before was gone. The clouds that had been so thick and dark and overwhelming were gone. The sky above was clear, filled with stars, and there was no wind at all. The parking lot was covered with snow from the storm, but no new snow was falling, and the air was still and relatively quiet. David walked to his truck in a state of profound disorientation, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The fuel gauge, which had been reading critically low when he'd parked the truck, now read at 3/4 full. 3/4 full. His truck had somehow refueled itself, or time had moved differently outside the diner than it had inside, or something else entirely had happened that David couldn't explain. He pulled out of the parking lot onto the highway, heading north toward Denver, and as he drove, he kept checking his mirrors, kept expecting to see the diner in his rearview mirror. But the diner wasn't there. The parking lot was empty. There was nothing behind him except highway and snow and night. When David checked his GPS to locate the diner's address, wanting to understand where exactly he'd been, the GPS showed no record of any diner at that location. No building, no structure of any kind, just empty highway. David drove the remaining 50 miles to Denver in a state of shock, unable to completely process what had happened to him over the past several hours. He delivered his cargo as scheduled, dropped off his truck at the company lot, and immediately began investigating. He had the 1948 coins. He had the receipt from the diner, the handwritten bill showing prices that hadn't been seen in decades. He had his phone's timestamp showing that 4 hours had passed, while he experienced only about 90 minutes. He had the memory of Margot's weary expression and her statement that "time's funny in here." He had his GPS data showing his location when he'd parked at the diner, coordinates that he immediately tried to verify. What he found was that the coordinates didn't correspond to any commercial structure. There was no restaurant at that location according to satellite imagery, according to property records, according to any official documentation. The location was simply empty farmland adjacent to the highway, land that had apparently been empty for decades, based on the satellite imagery history going back to the 1970s. David spent the next 3 days conducting research. He called the Colorado Department of Transportation and asked if they had any records of a diner on Interstate 25 in the section where he'd stopped. The woman on the phone told him there was no record of any such establishment. And furthermore, when David tried to describe the location, the dispatcher was confused because the coordinates he provided corresponded to a section of highway that had been rerouted in 1994. The old alignment of the highway had been abandoned and replaced with a new section that bypassed the old route entirely. The old highway section no longer officially existed, though it remained passable if you knew where to find it. For 3 days, he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just questions circling like the snow outside. David's breakthrough came when he decided to post about his experience on an internet forum dedicated to trucking. He wasn't expecting anyone to take him seriously, but almost immediately he began receiving responses from other truckers who'd had similar experiences. A driver named Michael from Kansas described pulling into a diner during a blizzard and receiving change in 1948 coins. A woman named Patricia from New Mexico said she'd encountered the same diner, she'd called it Margot's, and experienced the same strange time dilation, where hours had passed outside, but only minutes had passed for her subjectively. A retired truck driver named Carl said he'd been driving that section of highway for 35 years and had heard legends about the diner from other drivers, but he'd never actually encountered it himself because, as he noted, it only appears when the weather's bad, and when the weather's bad enough to make it appear, most drivers are too smart to stop. More drivers came forward, each with their own stories. A man named Jorge reported that he'd gone into the diner during a snowstorm and spent what felt like an hour inside, only to emerge and discover that 12 hours had passed. His truck's clock, his phone, even a watch he'd been wearing all showed that the entire night had gone by while he was inside the diner. A woman named Sandra said that she'd found a receipt from the diner in her wallet 3 months after having stopped there. And when she looked at it, the date had changed. What had been written as a date from the current year was now written in handwriting that appeared different, and the date shown was February 1948. The receipt she had from the diner was apparently from 1948, and the handwriting looked like it had been made with a fountain pen, the kind of pen that had been common in the 1940s but hadn't been used regularly in decades. David found a newspaper archive and began researching Margot's diner specifically. What he discovered was remarkable. The diner had actually existed. It was a genuine structure that had operated in the 1940s and early 1950s, located in a section of Colorado on what was then the primary highway route through that region. The diner had been known for excellent food and friendly service. It had been operated by a woman named Margot Sinclair and her husband, William Sinclair. According to historical records, the diner had closed in 1952 when the Sinclairs decided to retire. But here's where things became strange. The historical record showed that both Margot and William had died in 1948. Specifically, they died in a car accident during a severe blizzard on February 16, 1948, just a few miles from the diner. The newspaper account described how they'd been driving home from the diner late at night when their vehicle had gone off the road during the blizzard. They'd been killed instantly. The official cause of death was listed as injuries from the accident, but the deaths had occurred during the exact same blizzard that had driven David to seek shelter in a diner that shouldn't have existed. The newspaper article mentioned that the diner had been operated by employees after the Sinclairs' deaths, but it had eventually closed permanently when the new highway alignment had bypassed the old route entirely. David read that article multiple times, trying to make sense of what it could possibly mean. The Sinclairs had died in 1948. The diner had continued operating for several years after their deaths. The diner was now long gone, demolished, erased from the landscape. Yet David had just been served food by someone who appeared to be Margot herself, or at the very least, someone using her name and wearing clothing consistent with the 1940s. The diner he'd visited had appeared to be functioning exactly as it would have in 1948. The prices, the currency, the food, the clothing, all consistent with that specific year. The most rational explanation that David could devise was that somehow in that location, during severe blizzards when reality seemed to become permeable, a fold in time was occurring. The diner wasn't functioning in the present year. It was functioning as it had been on that night in 1948, the night that the Sinclairs had died. The location had become a kind of temporal eddy, a place where the events of that night were somehow preserved and replayed, or perhaps a place where time genuinely did move differently, where different years could exist simultaneously in the same space. David theorized that the diner was somehow serving people from different eras, bringing them together through the mechanism of the blizzard and the dangerous driving conditions that forced people to seek shelter. The fact that he'd received change in 1948, coins, wasn't coincidental. Those were the only coins that would have been available in that temporal state, in that frozen moment where 1948 was still real and present. But David was left with questions that he couldn't answer satisfactorily. If the diner was truly operating in 1948, why was Margot still there? Had she died and been unable to leave? Was she truly the spirit of Margot Sinclair, or was she something else entirely? Why did the diner appear only during blizzards? What was the mechanism that allowed this temporal phenomenon to occur? Why did some people's subjective time match the external time, while other people experienced the dramatic time dilation that David had experienced? Were people who entered the diner at risk? David's fuel gauge had been restored somehow. Was that a side effect of the temporal displacement, or was something else happening? David spent weeks investigating, reaching out to other people who'd had experiences with the diner, comparing notes, trying to develop a unified theory that could explain what was happening. But ultimately, no satisfying explanation emerged. The diner remained a mystery, a phenomenon that existed outside the boundaries of what conventional science acknowledged as possible, a place that seemed to operate according to rules that had nothing to do with the normal world. The diner continued to appear, allegedly, during winter blizzards in Colorado. Truckers continued to report finding it when they were desperate, when they needed shelter and warmth and refuge from the storm. And the diner always provided those things. It always served hot food and fresh coffee, and it always paid its customers in currency from 1948, currency that was far too old to still be in circulation, physical evidence that something genuinely extraordinary was happening at that location. What surprised David most as he dug deeper into the phenomenon was the size of the community of people who'd had similar experiences. There were hundreds of documented accounts dating back to at least the 1960s. People who'd encountered the diner, received meals, been paid in 1948 currency. The accounts showed a remarkable consistency. The diner always looked the same. Margot, or whoever was operating the diner, always appeared approximately the same. A woman in her 60s or 70s wearing 1940s clothing. The food was always excellent, always freshly cooked, always tasting like genuine home cooking rather than commercial preparation. The time displacement was consistent. Most people experienced the subjective passage of time being significantly shorter than the external passage of time, though the degree of displacement varied. Some people lost only an hour of external time, experiencing 30 minutes subjectively. Others lost much more. One account described a person who'd been inside the diner for what felt like 10 minutes, but had emerged to discover that 16 hours had passed. The consistency of these accounts, coming from independent witnesses spanning decades and different geographic locations, suggested that something genuine was occurring at that location, something that defied conventional explanation. David began to notice patterns in the accounts. The diner appeared most consistently during severe winter storms, blizzards specifically, not just snow. The diner appeared most frequently to truckers and other highway travelers, people who spent their lives moving between places, people who existed in that liminal space between origin and destination. The diner appeared more reliably during the night, particularly during the early morning hours between midnight and dawn. The diner seemed to appear specifically to people who were in genuine distress, low on fuel, lost, frightened, desperate for shelter. These patterns suggested that the diner wasn't simply a random temporal anomaly, but something more intentional, something that seemed designed specifically to serve people who needed help. There was a theory among some of the people David communicated with that the diner was some kind of refuge, a safe space created by Margot Sinclair's consciousness or spirit or some other form of entity to help people who found themselves in dangerous situations on the highway during blizzards. This theory had a certain appeal. It suggested that the phenomenon served a purpose, that there was something almost benevolent about it, that Margot was still trying to serve people and provide them with shelter and warmth and food, even after her death decades earlier. But David also learned about the dangers associated with the diner. There were accounts of people who'd spent what they believed was a few hours inside the diner, only to emerge and discover that days had passed. These people had lost their jobs, missed important appointments, had their families deeply worried about their disappearance, and presumed death. There were accounts of people who'd been inside the diner when they suddenly realized they couldn't leave, that the door wouldn't open, that they were trapped in a restaurant where time moved in incomprehensible ways. There were accounts of people who'd entered the diner and simply never emerged. They went into the building during a blizzard and were never seen again. In these cases, people had found the diner empty, had searched the building and found no trace of the missing person, had called the police only to discover that there was no official record of any diner at that location, making it impossible to file a missing person report for someone who disappeared into a place that didn't officially exist. The more David researched, the more he began to understand that the diner was not simply a benevolent phenomenon. Yes, it provided food and shelter to people in distress, but it also operated according to rules that weren't always beneficial to the people who encountered it. It extracted a price, not a monetary price, but a price in the form of displaced time, lost hours and days and weeks from people's lives. It took people who were at their most vulnerable and subjected them to something that defied their understanding of reality. For some people, this might have been acceptable, a fair trade for shelter during a deadly blizzard. But for others, particularly those who'd lost days or weeks or who'd disappeared entirely, the price seemed exorbitant. David became increasingly obsessed with understanding who or what Margot actually was. Was she the genuine spirit of the woman who died in 1948? Was she a kind of psychic residue, a manifestation of consciousness that had somehow become trapped in that location? Was she something else entirely, a being from another dimension, an entity that had simply taken on the appearance and mannerisms of Margot Sinclair? He found one account from someone who claimed to have asked Margot directly about her identity. According to this account, Margot had simply said, "I'm Margot, I've always been Margot, I run this diner." When the person had asked how long she'd been running the diner, Margot had given a response that was identical to what she'd told David. A long time. When the person had asked if she'd ever left the diner, Margot had said, "This is where I need to be. This is where people come when they need help." The answer suggested that Margot might be aware, at least to some degree, of what was happening, of the anomalous nature of the location and her presence there. It suggested that she might be making a conscious choice to remain in the diner, to continue serving people despite the strange circumstances, despite operating in a location that existed in a state of temporal flux. He found this tragic, the idea that Margot might be trapped or choosing to trap herself in this location, reliving the same actions over and over, serving meals to truckers who appeared mysteriously during blizzards, existing in a permanent state of 1948, unable or unwilling to move forward to any other time or place. As David continued his investigation, he began researching the history of the location itself, the specific stretch of highway where the diner appeared. What he discovered was that the location had been the site of numerous accidents and deaths over the decades. The old highway route that the diner had originally been on was particularly notorious for dangerous driving conditions. Weather systems that affected that location seemed to be more severe and unpredictable than they were in surrounding areas. Blizzards would often appear suddenly in that specific region, while remaining absent just a few miles to the north or south. Visibility on that section of road seemed to be worse than anywhere else in Colorado. Accidents on that section happened with disturbing frequency, some attributable to the weather, some seeming random and unexplained, some involving vehicles that crashed despite drivers claiming there was nothing wrong with their vehicle before the accident occurred. David read through decades of newspaper accounts describing fatal accidents on that section of highway. He discovered patterns. Accidents seemed to cluster around the time period when the diner had been operating. After the diner had closed and the highway had been rerouted, accidents on the new highway alignment seemed to be less frequent and less severe. This suggested that somehow the location itself, not just the building, but the geography, the specific place, was significant. The land had been spiritually charged, or electromagnetically significant, or something that David couldn't quite understand. Something that made the location prone to accidents and strange occurrences. The diner, built in that location, had somehow become part of that phenomenon. David's research led him to discover that the location had been spiritually significant to Native American peoples long before the diner had been built there. The area had been part of a travel route for various tribes, and according to historical records, it was considered a dangerous place by indigenous peoples. Several accounts mentioned that Native Americans avoided that specific location, referring to it as cursed or dangerous, a place where reality seemed to be thinner, where the barriers between worlds seemed more permeable. One account from a 19th century traveler described how Native American guides had warned him against camping at a specific location, the exact location where the diner would eventually be built decades later. The guides had described the location as being spiritually dangerous, as being a place where the normal rules of existence didn't apply. This suggested that the phenomenon wasn't new, wasn't created by the diner's construction or by the accident that had killed the Sinclairs. The location had been anomalous far longer, possibly for centuries or longer. The diner had simply built itself on top of an existing anomaly, had perhaps amplified the effect or given it a focus point through which the strangeness could manifest. David remained puzzled by the specificity of the temporal anchor to 1948. Why that year? Why not 1947 or 1950? Why was the diner always operating as if it were 1948? David theorized that 1948 was the year of the Sinclairs' death, and perhaps that was significant. The moment of their death might have become frozen in time, preserved as if in amber, creating a temporal eddy where that specific moment continued to repeat. But he found another theory that intrigued him more. 1948 was the year when the United States first began testing nuclear weapons, when the atomic bomb entered the world as an actual deployable weapon rather than theoretical possibility. Nuclear weapons testing in the late 1940s had tremendous electromagnetic effects that could potentially interfere with the fabric of reality in ways that conventional science didn't fully understand. Could the electromagnetic radiation from nuclear weapons testing have somehow amplified or activated the anomaly at that location? Could 1948 represent the moment when the anomaly became powerful enough to manifest physically, to create the diner as a temporal refuge? The theory was speculative and unprovable, but it suggested a connection between military testing and the paranormal phenomena occurring at civilian locations across America. David spent weeks communicating with other people who'd encountered the diner. He compiled their accounts into a document, trying to identify patterns and inconsistencies. What he discovered was that while the basic elements of the experience remained consistent, there were variations in people's subjective experiences. Some people reported that they'd had conversations with Margot, that she'd asked them questions about their lives, their families, where they were going. Other people reported that Margot had barely spoken to them at all, had simply served their food silently and accepted payment without engaging in conversation. One person reported that Margot had seemed to know details about their personal life, their name, their hometown, details about their family without being told. Another person reported that they'd felt a strange sense of sadness emanating from Margot, as if she were grieving something, as if she were trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from. A third person reported that they'd felt something almost predatory about Margot, that she'd seemed interested in them in a way that felt invasive, as if she were evaluating them for some unknown purpose. These varied accounts suggested that either Margot's behavior changed depending on circumstances, or that different people were encountering different manifestations, different entities presenting themselves as Margot. The truth, David suspected, was even stranger than that. After months of research and compilation of accounts, David developed a comprehensive theory about what the Snowbound Diner might actually be. His theory suggested that the location existed at a junction point between multiple dimensions or multiple temporal streams. The geographic anomaly that had existed at that location for centuries, or possibly longer, combined with the specific tragedy of the Sinclair's death and the electromagnetic effects of the nuclear testing era, had created a permanent fold in reality. The diner itself was a structure that existed partially in 1948 and partially in the present day, existing in a liminal state where both time periods were somehow simultaneously present. When people entered the diner during blizzards, when weather systems were disrupting electromagnetic fields and creating the exact conditions that amplified the anomaly, they were stepping into a place where time and reality operated differently. The people they encountered, including the person they believed to be Margot, might be conscious entities from 1948 who were somehow aware of their situation, or they might be something else entirely, psychic residue, consciousness artifacts, entities from other dimensions that had adopted human form. The food they were served was real food, but food that existed in a state of temporal flux, food that somehow bridged the gap between 1948 and the present day. The coins they received as change were genuine 1948 currency, because that's all that would be available in a place that was functioning as if it were 1948. David's conclusion about the diner was ultimately a cautionary one. He recognized that while the diner served a useful purpose, providing shelter and assistance to people who were in genuine distress during blizzards, it also represented a danger. The diner existed outside normal reality. The diner operated according to rules that humans couldn't fully understand or predict. The time displacement that occurred inside the diner could devastate people's lives, could cause them to lose days or weeks, or, in some cases, disappear entirely. David recommended that anyone who encountered the diner during a blizzard should enter with extreme caution, should be aware that their perception of time inside the diner might be unreliable, should consider leaving after a relatively brief period of time, rather than allowing themselves to become comfortable in the establishment. David also recommended that people should not, under any circumstances, bring children or others who were dependent on them into the diner, because the time displacement could result in those people disappearing and never being recovered. The diner was real. The phenomenon was genuine, but it was a phenomenon that came with profound dangers and should be approached with extreme caution. Despite months of research and hundreds of pages of documentation, David never arrived at a complete, satisfying explanation for what the snowbound diner was or how it functioned. The phenomenon remained fundamentally mysterious, operating according to rules that science couldn't explain or even fully investigate. The diner continued to appear, allegedly, during blizzards. People continued to report encounters with it. The diner continued to provide meals and warmth and shelter to desperate travelers, and it continued to demand payment in a currency from a time 75 years or more in the past. The location continued to be anomalous, continued to be the site of accidents and strange occurrences, continued to exist in a state of ambiguous reality. The Sinclairs continued to be present in the location, at least in some form, continuing to serve meals to people who were sufficiently desperate to seek shelter during deadly storms. Whether the diner was a blessing or a curse, whether it was trying to help people or exploit them, whether it was even real in any conventional sense, these questions remained unanswered. In the months following his initial encounter with the diner, David found himself unable to simply move on with his normal life. He became obsessed with the phenomenon. He signed up for routes that would take him back to Colorado, specifically routes that would pass through the section of highway where the diner supposedly appeared. He drove that section during winter months, hoping to encounter another blizzard, hoping to see the diner appear again. He never succeeded. Despite spending dozens of nights on that road during winter conditions, despite encountering multiple snowstorms and periods of reduced visibility, the diner never manifested for him again. David wondered if the diner appeared only once per person, if there was some rule about repeat visits that prevented the phenomenon from manifesting to people who'd already experienced it. Or perhaps the diner simply operated according to completely random rules that had nothing to do with logical patterns. Perhaps the encounter was meant to be unique, unrepeatable, a singular experience that couldn't be replicated no matter how many times someone returned to the location. David's obsession with the phenomenon began to affect his professional life. He started missing deliveries, arriving late to appointments, spending his time researching instead of driving. Eventually, his trucking company let him go, unable to tolerate his unreliability. David shifted to freelance driving work, taking whatever jobs he could get, but his focus remained on the diner and the phenomenon it represented. David kept the 1948 coins in a small velvet bag, which he carried with him constantly. He never spent them, never attempted to use them as currency. They remained as physical proof that his experience had been real, that he hadn't hallucinated the entire encounter. Occasionally, when he was doubting himself, when the memory of that night seemed too surreal and impossible to be genuine, David would take out the coins and hold them, would feel their weight and solidity, would examine their surface and the year stamped on each one. The coins were real, therefore the diner must have been real, therefore his encounter must have been real. There was no other explanation that made logical sense. Other people who'd had similar experiences reported the same phenomenon. They kept the coins from their transactions at the diner, using them as proof of something that officially didn't exist. Some of them had tried to sell the coins to collectors or put them on auction sites, but every time they'd attempted to do so, the coins had disappeared from their possession. The coins would simply vanish from wherever the person had placed them, would return to their pockets through mechanisms that the people couldn't explain. It was as if the coins wanted to remain with the person who'd received them, as if they were connected to the experience in some fundamental way that prevented them from being traded or sold or separated from their original recipient. In the final months before David decided to close his formal investigation and compile his findings into a document, he conducted interviews with a dozen different people who'd had encounters with the Diner. He recorded these interviews, transcribed them, created a comprehensive archive of documentation. The testimonials were remarkably consistent in their basic elements: the appearance of the Diner during a blizzard, the experience of being served by Margot or someone similar, the strange time displacement, the payment in 1948 coins. But each person also reported unique elements to their experience. One woman reported that she'd seen photographs on the walls of the Diner showing people she recognized from her own family history, ancestors from the 1940s that she'd only ever seen in family photo albums. A man reported that he'd tried to leave the Diner partway through his meal and found the door locked, unable to open it, and had had to sit back down and finish eating before the door would unlock. A retired driver reported that he'd spoken with Margot about wanting to leave, about needing to get back on the road, and that Margot had simply said, "You'll leave when you're ready. The road will still be there." Another driver reported that he'd heard someone crying in the Diner, crying from somewhere in the back of the building where the kitchen was. But when he'd investigated, he'd found no one there. David compiled all of these accounts, compiled hundreds of pages of documentation, and ultimately produced a comprehensive study of the phenomenon that he attempted to publish in academic journals, in paranormal research publications, in any outlet that would accept it. David's work was rejected by every conventional academic and scientific publication he submitted to, with reviewers claiming that the accounts were anecdotal, that there was insufficient physical evidence, that the phenomenon couldn't be properly investigated using conventional scientific methodologies. Paranormal research publications were more receptive, but even they expressed skepticism about some of his claims. Even they seemed uncomfortable with the implications of what he was documenting. Eventually, David published his work independently, making it available online through various platforms. The work attracted some attention within paranormal research communities, but mainstream recognition remained elusive. This was, David believed, intentional. There seemed to be an implicit understanding among various entities, government agencies possibly, academic institutions, the media establishment, that certain phenomena were meant to remain unexplained, were meant to exist in the spaces between official acknowledgement and complete denial. The Snowbound Diner was one of those phenomena. The evidence for its existence existed, the testimonials were consistent and numerous, the coins were real. But none of that was sufficient to create official recognition, to create institutional acknowledgement of the phenomenon. David entered what would be the final phase of his investigation. Before moving on to other pursuits, he found himself confronted with a final, unanswerable question. What was the Diner ultimately trying to accomplish? Was it helping people or harming them? Was it a benevolent phenomenon that existed to provide shelter and assistance to people in distress? Or was it something more sinister, something that was feeding on the displaced time, the confusion, the fear and disorientation that it created in the people who encountered it? Was Margot genuinely trying to help people, or was she trapped in an endless cycle of serving customers to people from different eras, unable to escape her fate, unable to move beyond the moment of her death? David didn't have answers to these questions. He suspected that the truth was more complicated than any simple dichotomy of good or evil, helpful or harmful. The diner was simply something that existed, something that operated according to its own rules and its own logic, something that existed in the spaces between dimensions, touching human reality only during the specific moments when weather and geography and human desperation created the right conditions for manifestation. The phenomenon would continue, people would continue to encounter the diner. The 1948 coins would continue to appear in people's pockets as proof of something that officially didn't exist. Margot would continue to serve meals, continue to exist in her 1948 state, continue to operate the diner in a location that existed partially in the past and partially in the present. The mystery would endure. The truth would remain hidden in the spaces between dimensions, accessible only to those desperate enough, brave enough, or unfortunate enough to encounter it during a blizzard on an empty Colorado highway. The snowbound diner is real, and it's still out there. If this story made you question what's real on the open road, hit subscribe and share it with a driver who's been caught in a storm. And remember, if you ever see a diner glowing in the snow, make sure you're ready to pay the real price. Drive safe and keep your lights on.